If you've watched the news lately, you've probably heard that the world is edging closer to a global war. Every headline feels like it's trying to raise your blood pressure on purpose. But here's the plot twist. Despite all that noise, we're actually living in the most peaceful time in human history. And strangely enough, one of the biggest reasons for that peace is the very thing everyone fears: nuclear weapons. For most of human history, major powers were constantly at each other's throats. Europe basically treated warfare like a competitive sport. The 1700s alone had so many conflicts that historians literally had to categorize them like movie sequels. But after 1945? Silence. No World War III. No continent-wide bloodbath. Great powers stared at each other across borders, and then decided, yeah, maybe let's not all die today. The Cold War was tense, sure, but even at the height of it, when the US and the Soviet Union were inches away from pressing the button, cooler heads prevailed. You could argue nuclear weapons scared humanity straight. Now imagine they all disappear tomorrow. Every warhead, every missile, every don't even think about it button. Gone. Just countries, armies, unresolved tensions, and absolutely nothing stopping them from acting on impulses they've suppressed for nearly 80 years. So the question becomes, if nukes vanished, who actually starts World War III? For decades, nuclear weapons have acted like the world's harsh but effective safety net. Economist Thomas Schelling said, nuclear weapons made major war almost unthinkable. He meant that once you can erase cities with one strike, suddenly everyone becomes a lot more polite. Even Henry Kissinger called nuclear deterrence the shield that prevented global suicide. Harsh, but accurate. Remove that shield, and the world becomes significantly more unpredictable. Deterrence is basically the world's most high-stakes don't-try-me energy. When two countries both have weapons capable of erasing the planet, it forces leaders to think logically rather than emotionally. Every decision becomes a chess move, not a fistfight. But once nukes disappear, that psychological barrier collapses. Leaders start assuming they can win. They start taking risks again. And historically, that's when disasters happen. A world without deterrence isn't a world with fewer wars. It's a world with more confidence, more miscalculation, and more chaos. So who moves first? The most obvious candidate is China. Without the threat of nuclear retaliation, Beijing's long-standing ambitions, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and several border disputes, suddenly look much easier to pursue the old-fashioned way, with a whole lot of troops. Right behind them is Russia, a country that historically expands whenever it senses an opportunity. With NATO's nuclear umbrella gone, Moscow might try to rearrange Europe again, which is a polite way of saying tanks start rolling. Then come the regional hotspots. Iran and Saudi Arabia could ignite the Middle East in seconds. Turkey might attempt to expand influence over its neighbors. North Korea, suddenly stripped of its main bargaining chip, might act aggressively just to stay relevant. And India versus Pakistan? That becomes one of the largest and most dangerous conventional wars the world has ever seen. Political scientist John Mearsheimer warned, great powers always search for opportunities to gain advantage. If constraints disappear, conflict returns. Without nukes, those constraints vanish instantly. China's military is the largest in the world by personnel, and it's been rapidly modernizing. Taiwan becomes target number one. Russia has always seen NATO expansion as a threat. Without nukes limiting its options, Moscow could gamble big. Iran and Saudi Arabia's rivalry is ideological, religious, and political, all three at once. North Korea, suddenly irrelevant without its nuclear card, may unleash aggression simply to stay on the map. India and Pakistan share borders, history, and unresolved disputes, making them one of the most explosive combinations on Earth. These aren't minor disagreements. These are decades of pressure just waiting for the safety valve to disappear. Once the first shot is fired, it spirals quickly. China pushes into Taiwan. The US, Japan, South Korea, and Australia respond. Russia moves into the Baltics or Poland. NATO snaps into action. The Middle East becomes a multi-front conflict with Israel, Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia all clashing. India and Pakistan mobilize millions of soldiers within days. The first weeks might look like a highlight reel of modern warfare. Drone swarms, cyber attacks, naval battles, aircraft engagements, and mechanized divisions moving at speeds we haven't seen since World War II. The US Navy would instantly secure the Pacific, but China's early attack could overwhelm Taiwan before reinforcements arrive. Russia might take parts of Eastern Europe quickly, but holding them becomes a nightmare once NATO mobilizes. The Middle East breaks into overlapping conflicts, each with different goals and alliances. India and Pakistan engage in trench warfare, aerial combat, and massive troop movements across the line of control. This isn't a single war, it's multiple regional wars merging into one global super conflict. And like every global conflict, alliances form fast. On one side, you'd likely get a massive coalition. United States, UK, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Australia. The countries with the most advanced tech, fleets, and industrial power. Opposing them, a Eurasian bloc. China, Russia, Iran, and possibly North Korea if they decide not to sit this one out. Then you have the swing nations, India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, countries whose choices might decide the entire war. As Zbigniew Brzezinski once said, the key to global power lies in Eurasia. The US-led alliance would dominate air and sea, but coordinating so many nations isn't easy. China and Russia cooperate, but they don't trust each other fully. Their strategies clash. Turkey and India, as swing powers, might switch sides based on who offers better deals. Supply lines become everything. Whoever controls trade routes, energy sources, and shipping lanes gains an enormous edge. This war wouldn't just be fought on battlefields, it's fought in factories, ports, and digital networks. Without nukes, that struggle becomes very literal. So who actually wins? In a long, grinding conventional war, the US and its allies have enormous advantages. Technology, logistics, naval power, global reach. Without nuclear weapons leveling the playing field, America becomes even stronger. China likely wins early battles in Asia, but struggles to sustain a long, multi-front war. Meanwhile, nations like India and Turkey rise dramatically as regional powers. They benefit from geography, manpower, and timing. Year by year, the war reshapes the world. Europe becomes heavily militarized again. China faces internal pressure as the economy strains. Russia's resources stretch thin. The US homeland stays mostly safe, giving it long-term dominance. India emerges as the most transformed nation, forced to industrialize rapidly and militarize like never before. By the end, borders change. Governments fall, economies collapse. Entire regions are unrecognizable. But none of this comes without a horrifying cost. Historian Max Hastings said, "Conventional world war is not less frightening than nuclear war. It is simply slower." And that's the frightening part. Year one alone could see 30 to 50 million deaths. A few years in, that number could cross 100 million. Cities destroyed not by nuclear blasts, but by relentless artillery, airstrikes, and urban warfare. Massive refugee movements, global food shortages, economies collapsing like dominoes, hospitals overflow, food becomes scarce, shipping routes collapse, power grids fail. This war isn't just soldiers, it's civilians caught in the middle. Refugee numbers reach hundreds of millions, creating a crisis larger than anything the world has ever seen. Cyber attacks shut down banks, electricity, and communication. Economies fall apart. Global famine becomes likely as countries hoard what little they have left. The human cost becomes the defining tragedy of the century. World War I and II, fought without nukes, killed over 100 million people. Taking nukes away doesn't guarantee peace. In many ways, it guarantees the return of the most destructive kind of war, one with no deterrent strong enough to stop it. So, the uncomfortable truth is that nuclear weapons, as terrifying as they are, forced world leaders to think twice. Without them, the world becomes a battlefield again. If every nuclear weapon disappeared tomorrow, who do you think fires the first shot? Let me know in the comments. This one's going to spark a real debate. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next video.